In 1968, two cryptozoologists visited a farm in Minnesota where a mysterious frozen body was kept. This body belonged to a creature known as the Minnesota Iceman, a fairground attraction that had been displayed at carnivals across the US and Canada, and it was beginning to draw the attention of researchers. These cryptid experts spent 3 days examining the body encased in a block of ice, and noticed numerous features that convinced them this was a genuine carcass of an unknown ape species. More than that, they concluded that here, on a farm in Minnesota, they had proof that Neanderthals had survived into modern times, as the Iceman could be nothing other than the recently deceased body of a living Neanderthal. Despite warnings from the Iceman's owner not to share any information about the body, the Minnesota Iceman was quickly publicized by the cryptozoologists, as they truly believed this was a world-changing discovery. This incident became international news, even attracting the attention of the Smithsonian, which requested the FBI to investigate the carcass, as one of the cryptozoologists suspected that the humanoid creature had been shot dead. The FBI ended up declining to help since there was no proof an actual crime had been committed, but the person who had the Iceman, a man named Frank Hansen, quickly claimed that the real body had been taken away, and he'd replaced it with a fake model replica of the original. The Smithsonian, after investigating the matter, came to the conclusion that the body was a fabrication and always had been, and dropped the case. However, the cryptozoologists who had seen the Iceman on the farm remained adamant that this was a real creature, and continued their own investigations. These researchers were Ivan T. Sanderson, a writer and biologist, and Bernard Heuvelmans, a Belgian-French writer and researcher, who together are often credited with establishing the field of cryptozoology, the study of unknown mystery animals, or cryptids. All this is a brief summary of what we covered in part 1 of this story, which I'd recommend watching if you haven't already for the full context. At this point in the bizarre tale that is the Minnesota Iceman, Frank Hansen had the creature back on display at fairgrounds again and was claiming this was a fake replacement body. On the other hand, Bernard Heuvelmans maintained that there had only ever been one real body, and that Hansen was thawing it out, repositioning it and refreezing it, to make it look different so he could claim it was simply a model to deflect interest from the authorities. Heuvelmans was also beginning to suspect a major conspiracy, as Hansen kept changing his story about how he acquired the body, and claimed that a mysterious Californian millionaire was in fact the true owner of it. Additionally, the withdrawal of the Smithsonian and FBI made Heuvelmans certain that higher powers within the US government were trying to keep something under wraps. So we're picking up the story in July 1970, when, in another bizarre twist, Frank Hansen published a magazine article called "I Killed the Ape Man Creature of Whiteface," an apparent confession as to where the body really came from. This was, once again, another very different origin story for the Minnesota Iceman. In this version of events, Hansen described how he'd been out hunting near Whiteface Reservoir in northern Minnesota in 1960 and happened upon a group of 3 hairy humanoid creatures devouring a deer and drinking its blood. One of the creatures charged Hansen, and in a panic, he shot it in the face. He immediately fled the scene and only returned a month later in December to retrieve the body for fear it might be found and reported. He stumbled upon the carcass buried in snow and frozen, and the next day came back to chisel it out of the hardened ground. He claimed he ended up hiding the body in a large meat freezer in the basement of his house in Duluth, where it remained until he bought the farm in Rolling Stone in the summer of 1961. After taking the body and concealing it on his new property, he no longer felt he had to rush to dispose of it since he was now living in a much quieter part of the state. After leaving the Air Force in November 1965, Hansen says he began to read more and came to learn of the abominable snowmen of the Himalayas, noting the resemblance of his body to these cryptids. In December 1966, Hansen decided to enter the business of fairground exhibitions, and apparently spoke to a lawyer about displaying the Iceman. The lawyer was reportedly concerned about potential charges Hansen may face if the creature were declared to be a human of some kind. Apparently, it was then that the idea of creating a fake model was brought up, so that, if questioned by the authorities, Hansen could point to evidence of a model being constructed to disperse any interest in the matter. According to Hansen, in January of 1967, he travelled to Los Angeles with sketches of the original carcass and found a company to build a fake rubber body, adding in the details of the injuries and then freezing the artificial corpse in a custom-made coffin. The body was then shown to the public for the first time in May 1967 in Los Baños, California, and advertised using the initial cover story about how it was found floating at sea. However, he wasn't satisfied with the response the model was getting, and so he decided that for the 1968 season, he would use the genuine carcass instead. He claims to have manipulated the real body to match the positioning of the fake one, even cutting tendons in the arms and legs to reposition the limbs. So, according to Hansen's apparent confession, the Iceman shown from May to November of 1968 was the real deal. Then, of course, Heuvelmans and Sanderson became involved in December, and he claimed to switch the bodies once more. Hansen finished his article by stating that possibly the entire confession was a fabrication, and that he would deny every word if necessary. He also wrote that, in the meantime, I will continue to exhibit a hairy specimen that I've publicly acknowledged to be a fabricated illusion, and leave the final judgment to the viewers. If one should detect a rotting odour coming from a corner of the coffin, it is only your imagination. Despite the, shall we say, rather unlikely nature of this tale, it nevertheless inspired one man, a Mr. Forrest Frosty Johnson, to undertake an expedition into the forests of northern Minnesota to track down other members of this mystery ape population that apparently called this region home. Frosty's expedition was documented in another magazine article published in 1971, which explained how they essentially found nothing, not even any tales of wild ape men among the locals. However, the article also mentions another confession of Hansen's, once again stating that he still wasn't the real owner of the Iceman, and that the anonymous wealthy individual had paid for the model to be made and the truck to transport it around in. Heuvelmans writes at length in his 1974 book about how he strongly suspected this entire tale of Hansen's to be made up, poking numerous holes in the story and arguing that Frosty's expedition adds to the evidence against it. However, the cryptozoologist was still utterly convinced that the body he'd examined was from a real dead creature, and even at this point, after all the contradictory lies and shady manipulation of events, maintains that Homo pongoides existed. Rather than believing Hansen's version of events, Heuvelmans constructs what he considered a far more reasonable and logical explanation for all the deception thus far. Obviously, the Iceman had been shot in Vietnam, before Hansen then smuggled the corpse into the US in the coffin of a soldier killed in the Vietnam War, triggering the start of a multi-billion-dollar illegal drug trade controlled by the mafia and resulting in a large-scale cover-up to protect the interests of US intelligence services. I promise I am not joking. Heuvelmans presents this alternative entirely seriously, providing what he states to be verifiable facts that together paint a perfectly consistent story. According to him, there is nothing incoherent, incomprehensible, illogical, or inexplicable about this. His reasoning for this series of events was based on a news item he came across in the early 70s, and later a book published in 1972 called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which talked about how the bodies of US soldiers killed in Vietnam were being stuffed with heroin for import into America, and alleged that the CIA were complicit in these activities. But Heuvelmans doesn't just suggest that the Minnesota Iceman could have been smuggled in one of the coffins by the drug traffickers. Oh no, he claimed that the entire operation was in fact inspired by the original venture of smuggling the Iceman to the States. He suggests that once it was realized it was possible to get a body into the US in secret by placing it in a coffin marked "Do Not Open" and flying it back in a military cargo plane, this opens the floodgates for a much larger and more nefarious enterprise. Heuvelmans also points out that Frank Hansen had been stationed with his fighter group at Da Nang Airport in Vietnam, and so thinks it was he who arranged the initial smuggling of the Iceman out of the country, but doesn't necessarily accuse Hansen of being deeply involved with the drug smuggling that he was sure sprouted out of his idea. Nevertheless, once he was back in civilian life in the States and in possession of the Iceman, Heuvelmans suggests Hansen had to keep quiet about the body's true origins, for fear of what the mafia might do to him if people were to learn of their smuggling operation. So, of course, he has a fake duplicate constructed as a precaution that he can then point to and avoid too much trouble. Then he also thinks that perhaps he could claim the humanoid creature was killed in America, so he wouldn't have to explain the illegal smuggling. So, according to Heuvelmans, he would clearly need to consult a specialist on cryptid apes to check if they could tell the difference between an American and a Vietnamese ape man. As such, he arranges to have someone call a prominent expert, Ivan Sanderson, and bait him into coming to look at the body. But then, unexpectedly, the expert ends up informing the FBI in an attempt to take the body away for study, and his colleague publishes about it in a journal, and suddenly things start to unravel. This is when Heuvelmans explains the people Hansen had been involved with to facilitate the smuggling start to get angry and threaten him, and he's forced to pretend to switch out the bodies. But of course, Heuvelmans thinks it was always the same body that was just refrozen. After this, Heuvelmans believes the model makers were made to come forward to confirm that it was a fake, helping to cover up the true origin. The Smithsonian backs out, and the FBI are no longer interested in the Iceman. From then on, Heuvelmans felt as though only he and a few select others were on a lonely quest to unearth this major conspiracy, as all other parties began to work against them for fear of exposing the drug smuggling tactic of hiding heroin in soldiers' coffins. This, he states, explains why Hansen was allowed back into the country after the incident at the Canadian border, without having to subject the body to a biopsy, since much higher powers were involved and wanted to keep the validity of the Iceman in question. And of course, it explained why Heuvelmans' attempts to urge American authorities to look into the Iceman were continuously ignored. Eventually, federal agents exposed the heroin smuggling activities. However, Heuvelmans still suspected that official agencies were trying to suppress the story, as some people were still making money from all this. As further evidence to support this version of events, Heuvelmans points to a 1966 article written by a war correspondent visiting soldiers along the Vietnamese demilitarized zone, who apparently mentioned killing a huge ape. No date or many more details were given for this incident, but Heuvelmans suspected it could very well have been the Iceman himself, his Homo pongoides. Additionally, he links in another tale that supposedly occurred in 1949, when a member of the Vietnamese resistance went to explore the mountains of Dak Lak province. In one of the particularly remote regions of these mountains, the explorer encountered human footprints, which eventually led to a cave where they discovered a frightened, hairy, human-like creature that didn't speak any recognizable language. Naturally, the resistance member and his companions decided to tie the creature up and take him back to the camp to see if they could communicate. However, apparently the hairy man refused to eat anything offered to him apart from specific palm leaves and raw meat, and after efforts to talk failed, they realised they'd have to take him back to the mountainous region where the palm trees grew. Unfortunately, on the way back he died, and they buried his body somewhere along the route. So yeah, clearly a far more straightforward and logical explanation than the Iceman being a fake body from the start, right? Heuvelmans' conviction that some sort of conspiracy was working against him to prevent him from proving the existence of living Neanderthals is just plain bizarre, and his attitude that the Minnesota Iceman could absolutely not have been a hoax clearly led him to some incredibly strange conclusions. I just don't know how he could write this insane story and then honestly present it as a far more likely option than the body just being faked. But of course he labelled anyone who didn't agree with his conclusions or didn't take the Iceman seriously as being dishonest, stupid and unscientific, for not investigating what had, at that point, been stated to be a hoax several times already. So what exactly happened to the Minnesota Iceman in the end? And what became of Bernard Heuvelmans, Ivan Sanderson and Frank Hansen? Heuvelmans and Sanderson's relationship never fully recovered after they clashed over publishing their observations on the Iceman, with Heuvelmans' note in the scientific journal appearing before Sanderson's magazine article. Whereas Heuvelmans thought it would encourage more scientific inquiry into the matter and thus help them access the specimen, Sanderson blamed the Heuvelmans publication for Hansen's quick reaction and apparent disposal of the original body. Heuvelmans, in turn, took issue with Sanderson's habit of building sensation and mystery around the Iceman, and acting more like a showman while he attempted to build scientific credibility. They also disagreed over the identity of the creature, with Sanderson believing it to be a member of a much more archaic Homo erectus grade of humans rather than a Neanderthal, as Heuvelmans thought. Sadly, Sanderson died not long after the whole Iceman affair, and while Heuvelmans was still writing his book, in February 1973 at the age of 62. Heuvelmans would go on to publish several more books on cryptozoology over the decades, and passed away at the age of 84 in August 2001. Frank Hansen continued to display the Minnesota Iceman at various fairs, in malls, and apparently at car dealerships, but interest in the creature died down significantly after he'd announced that he wasn't showing a real body. Eventually, it stopped appearing publicly. Hansen died in March 2003 at the age of 80. Then, in 2008, an interview with Vern Langdon was posted online by a podcast called The Bigfoot Show. Langdon was a mask maker, makeup artist, and musician, among many other things, who worked on all the original Planet of the Apes films and various other projects as part of Don Post Studios. In this podcast episode, Langdon revealed how he and his colleagues, including Don Post and legendary prosthetic makeup artist John Chambers, were contacted by Frank Hansen, who showed up in LA with sketches of the Iceman that he wanted them to create. According to Langdon, they realised it was going to be a big hoax, and didn't really want to be a part of it, but told him to go and speak to Howard Ball. Howard Ball was the person who built the famous life-sized Columbian mammoth statues at the La Brea tar pits, a very talented model maker indeed. Howard agreed to build it, and a couple of months later, the Iceman was born. But at this stage, the body was still hairless and unpainted, and so it didn't look particularly convincing yet. After refusing to paint the Iceman himself when Hansen asked, Langdon then referred him to someone he knew at Universal, Werner Kepler, another makeup artist who worked on the Planet of the Apes films and Star Trek. Kepler, or at least a member of his makeup department, was then the one responsible for painting the Iceman, as well as ventilating it, meaning hand-stitching every single one of the hairs into the body. So Hansen once again returned to Langdon with the finished model, and Langdon suggested going to a company called Union Ice, which was able to freeze the model for Hansen before he placed it into the box with built-in refrigeration and took it on the road. Interestingly, after Hansen had his run-in with Heuvelmans and Sanderson and started to gain a lot of attention, Langdon recounts how Hansen returned to LA and requested to have dinner with him. During this dinner, Hansen told Langdon the same old story about how he actually had a real body that was found floating in a block of ice, which he claimed to have purchased and brought into the US. However, Langdon wasn't having any of it, knowing that Hansen really only possessed the one model that he had literally seen being made, and so he left the man with the bill, never to see him again. Also of note here is that, according to Langdon, Hansen never mentioned a mystery true owner to him, stating that he owned the Iceman himself. I appreciate as well that the interviewers in this episode asked Langdon to clarify whether Frank Hansen had initially come to them claiming he had another body already, and that his model was meant to replicate it. And the answer was no. He never said anything about there being two Icemen, and that he had told them he intended to tour this model as an attraction, which he needed built from scratch. So the story about there being two bodies was definitely just Hansen making something up when he began to get questioned about transporting a real body, while still being able to maintain an uncertainty about what the Iceman was, ensuring that people would continue paying to see it. At some point after Hansen died in 2003, Hansen's son then sold the Minnesota Iceman to another Minnesota resident, who occasionally brought it out at Halloween hayrides. Apparently he was keeping it unfrozen and the model was becoming a bit mouldy. Then in 2013, the model appeared on eBay for $20,000. In the end, it was purchased by the Museum of the Weird, based in Austin, Texas. The transport of the Iceman from Minnesota to Texas was even featured in an episode of Shipping Wars. The Iceman remains to this day at the museum in Austin, and honestly, I would love to go and see it one day. So just to be clear, the current Iceman that's on display is without a doubt a fake model. I do find it very strange that Heuvelmans argued so adamantly that there had only ever been one body. It seems to me that the easiest way that proponents of the Iceman's validity could avoid being definitively proven wrong would be for them to maintain that the original was disposed of and replaced with the artificial copy. But Heuvelmans was sure it had always been the same body, just repositioned slightly. This essentially means that ultimately, Heuvelmans was arguing in favour of it always being a fake, since we can now see for sure that it's a fabrication. Doesn't exactly make Heuvelmans look like a particularly good scientist. Apparently, a highly detailed anatomical description of the Iceman still exists, which is several hundred pages long, that Bernard Heuvelmans had prepared but never published. That would be really interesting to see one day. 1 In his book on the subject, Heuvelmans does explore what he thinks the existence of this Homo pongoides means for Neanderthal evolution. Interestingly, Heuvelmans had a view of Neanderthals that one could consider somewhat ahead of his time. He explains how many older reconstructions of these extinct cousins of ours were strongly biased by the cultures and attitudes of the time, and by the opinion that they represented a brutish primitive stage in the march of progress towards modern humans. But, he writes, this is an outdated way of thinking. Indeed, today we have a far more nuanced understanding of Neanderthals as intelligent, artistic people, and a better understanding of human evolution as a complex web of gene flow involving multiple different branches coexisting for significant lengths of time, and no one single direction of evolutionary improvement towards our modern species. But then, Heuvelmans starts to construct his own hypothesis about what Neanderthals must have looked like. This hypothesis seems to ignore a lot of fossil evidence and is heavily based on his assertion that the Iceman was a modern representative of the lineage. Heuvelmans argues that Neanderthals simply must have had hair all over their bodies, as they were living in colder climates, and that they had upturned noses much like the Iceman's based on the shape of Neanderthal skulls. This nose anatomy, with the nostrils facing forwards, surely enhanced their sense of smell, and he argues it to be another cold climate adaptation, as it most resembles the snub-nosed monkey which can live in cold regions. He also argues for wide mouths with no lips, large eyes enabling them good nocturnal vision, less opposable thumbs, broad feet with curving toes for traversing mountainous environments, and even the capability of semi-hibernation. This version of the Neanderthal is explained by Heuvelmans as originally having split off from an ancestor that looked a lot like Homo sapiens, which began to undergo what he terms dehumanization. This dehumanization process, according to the cryptozoologist, started tens of thousands of years ago when the Neanderthals became isolated in regions of Europe and Asia, and they had to become more specialized to survive the harsh climates of the glaciations. According to Heuvelmans, evidence of this evolutionary trajectory can already be seen in some of the later fossils of Neanderthals. Then, he hypothesizes that the Iceman represents the final extreme result of the accelerated Neanderthal evolution. Heuvelmans further suggests that ancient Homo sapiens may have seen these less human-like Neanderthals as game animals to hunt, or perhaps slaves, or even potentially beasts of burden that they could domesticate. These hairy Neanderthal descendants were well suited to survive in cold climates and, according to Heuvelmans, must have survived to the modern day in small populations in the mountainous regions of Asia, avoiding Homo sapiens as much as possible and mostly living solitary lives. However, they had lost much of their culture, as well as their previous capability to use tools and construct shelters. Needless to say, there are many issues with the interpretations of fossil Neanderthal anatomy made by Heuvelmans, which contradict his view of Neanderthal life appearance. Modern efforts to reconstruct Neanderthal faces and overall anatomy, using known thicknesses of different regions of skin and the shapes of the underlying bone, have shown that Neanderthals would have looked notably different from modern humans, but still remarkably similar enough that we would recognize them as people. Just on average shorter, more robust and wide-chested people, who would not have had upturned snub noses, lacked lips, or been fully covered in thick hair. In fact, the idea that an upturned nose was a necessary cold adaptation has been thoroughly disproven now, thanks to a study that has simulated airflow through the nose of a Neanderthal. Not only did this research reconstruct the shape of the Neanderthal external nose, which would have looked like a modern human's nose but slightly larger and broader, it also found that it was perfectly well suited for life in cold and dry climates, with adaptations to warm up cold air before it entered the lungs. Also, the statement that Neanderthals must have had a better sense of smell than modern humans has turned out to be false. Studies on the shape of the Neanderthal brain, as determined from skull shape, indicate that they had smaller olfactory bulbs, so smell was likely not as important to Neanderthals. Heuvelmans' ideas about the hands and feet of Neanderthals are likewise not supported by the fossil evidence available to us. He states that the specialized later Neanderthals from which his Homo pongoides evolved had long and weakly opposable thumbs, better for grasping at rock ledges and collecting plant matter than using tools. But that's simply not what Neanderthal thumbs were like. They would have had similar proportions to modern humans and were capable of the same kind of dexterity, so they were clearly capable tool users. Plus, the proportions of Neanderthal foot bones and the individual anatomy of almost all these bones are pretty much the same as in modern humans, with the only real differences to Homo sapiens being found in one of the ankle bones. So again, Heuvelmans' claims that Neanderthals were becoming adapted for walking over mountainous terrain are just not supported by the fossils. Furthermore, our understanding of Neanderthal culture and technology presents further evidence against Heuvelmans' hypothesis. Rather than showing any signs of losing the capability to create technologies, Neanderthals are known to have switched from using a more basic to a more complex kind of stone tool industry over the course of the species' existence, although they then seem to have stuck with this industry for a very long time. Their ability to innovate and to pass down the knowledge to the next generation was potentially limited by their small overall population size. However, there is no sign that they lost technological capabilities. They just may not have been able to compete with Homo sapiens technology when they arrived in Eurasia. Still, Neanderthals were incredibly resourceful people, creating tools from shells, making art, and even utilizing natural earth pigments such as red ochre. Basically, whatever the Iceman was, a Neanderthal is low down on the list of possibilities. Sure, you could try to argue that all of the changes associated with dehumanization must have occurred in the last 40,000 years, and we just haven't found the fossils yet. But that's simply not science, it's making things up. Heuvelmans is engaging in evolutionary world building that's pretty baseless given the direct fossil evidence we have, and it's very clearly just constructed to make Neanderthals fit his interpretation of Homo pongoides. So to be clear, in my opinion, yes, the Minnesota Iceman is a hoax, and this is not a Neanderthal body frozen in ice, nor is it Bigfoot or any of the alternatives. I personally think it's incredibly doubtful that an original body ever existed, considering how many times Hansen changed his story about where it came from, and that he would never reveal who the mystery true owner was. Plus, of course he would want to keep the mystery going as he had a financial stake in drumming up interest in the creature to keep people paying to see it. And then there was Heuvelmans arguing against there ever having been duplicate bodies, which really doesn't help his case, considering that the only body currently known is a rubber one. Ironically, it seems like Heuvelmans did a lot of the work that can be used to cast significant doubt on the validity of the Iceman, as he picked apart Hansen's tales of its origin too, further demonstrating how unlikely they were. I think in all likelihood there was just one fake body that, like Heuvelmans suggested, Hansen thawed and repositioned slightly before freezing again. In fact, just looking at the photos that Heuvelmans took when he first saw the body and comparing them to the fabrication now on display in Austin, you can see plenty of similarities that prove this is almost certainly the same model. You also have to remember that Heuvelmans only ever saw the body through thick, frosted ice and the glass coffin, so it's not like he ever had a particularly good or close-up view, with many details being obscured. And I don't really think the bad smell is a particularly compelling argument for it being real either. Is it not possible that the rubber model itself may have smelled quite strange? Or perhaps Hansen himself did something to the coffin so it emanated a peculiar odour, to add an air of authenticity to his tale. Again, this whole story really doesn't make Heuvelmans or indeed Sanderson look very competent as researchers, given how completely they believed in the reality of the Iceman and absolutely refused to consider the possibility that it was faked. Nevertheless, it's a fascinating story with so many weird twists and turns, and it represents an iconic chapter in the history of cryptozoological research. Heuvelmans seems to have been a very interesting guy, and it's been quite captivating to read the translated version of his 1974 book. The way he presented everything as being entirely logical and, to him, scientific, while also spinning this elaborate and rather insane story about smuggling the body from Vietnam, is, I think, a revealing insight into his thought process, and his feelings that he was the one man in pursuit of this world-changing truth. He seems to have become so obsessed with the body being real that any critical thinking skills just vanished. He twisted tangential stories about cryptids in Vietnam to suit his narrative, and made all sorts of provably false claims about Neanderthal anatomy and evolution to support his foregone conclusions. And all the while, he presents himself as a respectable scientist with airtight reasoning. I'd still recommend reading the book if you're interested, and for even more details about this whole saga, plus the 2016 translated version features an afterword with a more modern perspective on the Iceman. Although, weirdly, this part still hints at the possibility that the body was real, despite the huge mountain of evidence suggesting otherwise. I'd also be very interested to hear from anyone who remembers seeing the Iceman themselves, so please do leave a comment below if you ever got to see it. Where was it, and what did you think of it? Could you see any of those details that apparently convinced Heuvelmans and Sanderson, such as the plant matter in the teeth or parasites in the fur? And of course, did you smell anything strange? Well, I really hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at the bizarre story of the Minnesota Iceman, which was not a Neanderthal body found frozen in ice. It's been a long time since we talked about this cryptid on the channel, and I thought after all these years it would be good fun to cover it again, in much more detail this time. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to my other channel, 7 Days of Science. Over on this channel, my co-presenters and I make weekly videos covering all the most fascinating science news of the past week. So if you'd like a good way to keep up to date with the latest discoveries, you might like what we do over there. We also have a Patreon page where you can support us in return for some fun bonus content. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and be sure to press that bell icon so you don't miss our next upload, and so you can learn more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all.